Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Jacob Saindon is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of Kentucky. Jacob, thanks for speaking with me today.
Happy to be here, Greg.
Oh, that's great. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
Um, so my PhD dissertation is really focused on attention, and specifically attention as it relates to the advertising industry, both historically and as it exists in the current day. And it really kind of starts actually with the current day, with digital technologies, digital media in particular. Um, and as you know, you and probably many of the listeners have heard, there's a lot of focus on something called the attention economy, right? This idea that we are in kind of a moment when attention is very scarce, or there's a lot of pressure put on it, and so there's a lot of interest in how our attention engages with digital technologies, digital media. Um, and so my interest is trying to connect that to the advertising industry, what the role that they play, especially in these digital media, as social media, for example, is by and large very much reliant on advertising for its financial profitability. And then also pull that back to earlier kinds of attention markets, attention economies that we might not have considered to be attention economies in the same sense that we consider digital media attention or the internet to be an attention economy. And so try and pull from historical sources, draw through lines between how attention has been thought about and treated and measured in particular by the advertising industry, and then of course, as a geographer, I'm interested in how that kind of is connected to space. So how we can think about, I sometimes use the term attention spaces, which isn't super precise, but really just focusing on how attention emerges from space and how it shapes particular spaces and relates to media in that way.
Hmm. What drew your attention to the subject?
Well, before I started graduate school, I actually worked in digital marketing and advertising for a little while. Um, And I really wanted to come in and think about digital media and space and kind of what was going on there. And so, given my background, I was really interested in attention just from the get-go, and kind of came across, a variety of different kind of materials that I thought were interesting, and kind of coalesced in that way, and really coming across materials like the Hagley archives and others was really kind of exciting for me to see the historical things, especially a lot of times we get very focused, especially our my subdiscipline is kind of digital geographies, is how many kind of scholars working in the space describe themselves. We're very caught up oftentimes in what's going on in the digital, right? And so historicizing it is a very kind of important task that um, we're still working towards in a lot of ways.
Sure. Well, that seems like a really noble and worthy project. Could you perhaps unpack digital geography a little bit? That seems almost like an oxymoron, given that the digital space is not really a space, although we think about it and talk about it that way. So perhaps you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of in some ways, it's a complicated little subdiscipline, because there's a number of different ways we can think about how the digital engages with space.
Mm.
Oftentimes, we'll think about how space is represented digitally. So mapping. A lot of people work with GIS, geographic information systems, creating web maps and things like that, right? So representation is one part of it. Another part of it is how shape is produced, or sorry, shape, space is produced or reproduced using or through digital technologies, right? So the fact that cities are often loaded up with digital technologies and sensors and things like this, that we're all carrying around a smartphone with a navigation app that many of us are using Google Maps every day to drive to and from work or do trips or things like this, how that is affecting how we engage with, move through space. Um, And really, the perspective that I take and that a lot of digital geographers take, and human geographers more broadly take, is one of kind of relational space, which is this notion that it kind of pushes back against, I'd say, a traditional notion of space, which is that it's a static container in which activities happen. And so in relational space, it's more of that space emerges from what occurs within it, is maybe one way to say that. So the kind of different trajectories that we're all taking, how we engage with one another, and with other elements, non-human elements in that space as well, which is where the digital comes in, right? Technologies, but also all sorts of other factors as well. So the production and reproduction of space. And then there's also thinking about how kind of we can think about geographies of the digital or describe how what happens on the internet in this kind of non-space, as you kind of pointed to, or this virtual space, as some people think about it, how that actually, relies upon specifically spatial metaphors has been a focus. So like the information like the superhighway, so thinking about right like the highway as kind of a spatial metaphor. Sometimes the internet's like a public square or something like this. So how we rely on understandings of space or spatial metaphors to think about how we're engaging kind of virtually. So those are maybe three ways. There's all sorts of kind of emerging work happening with digital geographies. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, it seems then it's as much about perception as it is about materiality in that context. And I guess that brings in your subject of attention as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, that's for me, attention is really a key lever between the virtuality of digital space and also the materiality of it, where you know you and I are talking through a screen right now, but we're also each in our respective spaces, right? And so, and especially there's this kind of phenomenon, which I think it's maybe elided sometimes when we're thinking about how people are engaging with screens or through screens, like, oh, you're on an app, you're clicking through, you're watching a video and whatever, but you're also still right in space. And so there's kind of this particular way in which I think we can think about attention as a or phenomenon, which emerges from our like relationship with the screens and also with the environments around us, even if we're not necessarily aware of it. And also, certain spaces are more conducive to attention relative to digital media. Um, Other spaces are not. And again, if we're thinking about like production and reproduction, the ways in which it's a bi-directional relationship, excuse me, where space is conducive maybe, but also what we're then doing in this space changes the characteristics of that space. And so maybe we can, in this way, it's very much kind of it's hard to pin down attention is part of why I'm interested in it. And I think the spatial elements of that are really a key complexity that I'm interested in. And so I think the fact that it's difficult is what's interesting to me about it.
Mhm. Now, could you maybe historicize that idea of the attention economy a little bit? I think we are a little bit familiar with its relevance in the current moment, especially when it comes to different major tech firms vying for our attention, not only in advertising, but also locking us into their ecosystems of services. Um, so could you perhaps project that back, historicize that a little bit, and explain where that is coming from and what the sort of prehistory of this moment might be?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a big question, and I can talk about some of the case studies that I've been working with,
Great.
and some of the longer elements there. I mean, and we've had histories of the advertising industry. There are a number of really good, really thorough ones out there that have been around, or that kind of chop it up, going back, for a very, very long time. I'd say typically we kind of um, peg the beginnings of like maybe what we call the modern advertising industry to, roundabouts the Industrial Revolutions in the 1800s, when we started to see kind of a production outpace consumption. And so the idea of that advertising is meant to stimulate consumption so that we can kind of match up with production. So that's maybe the starting point of of advertising, the advertising industry in a very simple way. Um, and so in that regards, attention, right, emerges at a similar point, which is basically with, or our maybe modern understandings of attention emerges with kind of the also the modern discipline of psychology, I would say.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So late 1800s, maybe early 1900s as well, is when we start to see attention as a discrete concept come into play, as a specifically as a discrete kind of human faculty, right, of the mind,
Mm.
of the brain, of the body. Um, uh, but before we can trace it further back, right, we can talk about the mind, we can talk about consciousness. There's kind of a lot of overlap there that scholars have teased out. But if we stick specifically with attention as it is, kind of as it, yeah, if we stick with attention, it kind of start us there.
Mm-hmm.
So advertisers, of course, are paying attention to what's going on in psychology, especially kind of at the in the early 1900s is when I'd say they start kind of having a conversation. There are books that come out about the psychology of advertising specifically, and how those two relate. And so this is, I think, when we start to see attention come into it, specifically attention come into advertising. And at that point, it's the economics of attention, I would say, are right, as I said, just to how to stimulate a purchase, like how to get a consumer to pay attention to something and then to become interested in it. There's a model like I don't know, it's AIDA, AIDA, attention, interest, desire, action, I think. And that's kind of a model that has been around since the early 1900s and has been changed in a number of ways, but that's still kind of the framework, right? And so attention is at the very beginning of that.
Mm.
And so my interest really comes in as to how do we measure attention, right? So at that point, we're measuring attention. There's something called attention value that scholars, particularly, oh my gosh, I forget his name. It'll come back to me, but it's kind of theorized, or Harlow Gale actually uses it first. He's a psychologist, and then it gets picked up by advertisers, right? So attention value, that basically how attractive is an advertisement, how likely is it to kind of pique your interest, and that is really a comparative measure. It's just if how many people will look at an advertisement and remember it or recall it versus this other advertisement. And then from there, we start to see other kind of measurements emerge in different industries in different ways. So one of the things I'm looking at are billboards, specifically around the 1930s, 40s, 50s, right, which have a really clear spatial component too, which is why one of the reasons I'm interested in that. But so there's an organization that comes into being called the Traffic Audit Bureau in 1933, and they develop a procedure, for example, to measure the circulation of billboards, how many people are driving by it, right? That's one part of it. But also they develop as part of that procedure something called the space position value, which kind of takes, I'd say, a version of that attention value, whether explicitly or not, and applies that to the visibility of billboards, right? So it's how far away from it, how quickly are you approaching it, what's its angle to the road, and it applies it, gives it a score, right? So when we're measuring attention in that way, when we're actually giving a certain piece of media a score, a value, a metric, that metric I think is where we enter into kind of a more contemporary relationship with attention, right? Because everything we do today, our attention is measured in certain ways. It's pegged, it's compared. And once you have a metric and a measurement, you can also assign it a value, right? And so that's really where we enter into this economics. I know this was a long segue into that, but when we have measurements, that's when we can peg value.
Mm.
And so really the relationship between attention, between its measurement, between the valuation of it, that's really where I'm kind of interested in tracing the longer histories and seeing how that has evolved. And then a lot of that is, versus when we talk about attention economies today, it's sometimes in maybe a broad or abstract sense of economies where it's like kind of just a competition, basically, a sense of that. But we can also get more concrete and talk about markets for attention, like how they're actually turned into those commodities and then exchanged or bought or sold. And so that's attention markets is maybe a more specific focus of my project.
Well, maybe you could explain a little bit more about that. What is an attention market and how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, so it's basically just attaching the like an exchange value to a
Hmm.
measurement of attention,
Hmm.
right? And so when we think about how something a good, I mean, we get kind of get very basic, but like how a commodity is made, right? I can
Hmm.
go back to Marx, and talk about how we take kind of raw materials and turn that into something which has economic value, has exchange value, has use value, um, and so on. So basically, that process of taking something which does not inherently have economic value and turning it into an economic object, right? That has a long, history of analysis in the social sciences, and you know how we can try to trace goods, and that's all of that is in, that's the purview of economics, for example. And so we have a lot of ways that we can think about commodities and economic activity and measures and things like this. And so the interesting thing about attention is that it is a human faculty at the same time as it is a commodity. So it's not only how do we kind of get into these markets, how we evaluate it and exchange it, but then also how does that reflect back on us, right? Um, there are probably other examples of this, but none are coming to mind right now. Um, but yeah, that's part of what's so interesting about the kind of the exchange, circulation, valuation of attention is
Hmm.
that it is taken kind of from a human source and it comes back to a human source at the end, but having been changed in some ways. And I think a lot of the contemporary concern for attention in digital media is concerned with that relationship, but maybe not described in such a way, I think.
Hmm. Well, it seems like a really rich subject area and really good to think with.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Um, I'd like to hear a little bit more about outdoor advertising. You mentioned billboards in particular as
Mm.
perhaps one of the subject areas you're researching. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and perhaps why it's useful to you?
Yeah, so I mean, billboards are, as I said, like have a very clear spatial element, right? They exist in space, and also historically, well, yeah, historically, also in cities. Nowadays, there, of course, outdoor advertising is in cities, but also spread more so along the highway system. But um, in the kind of time period I was looking at in the 1930s with Tab, really they were concentrated in cities. Um, and so thinking about how urban design and kind of billboard placement and measurement fit together is kind of a really fruitful and also explicitly spatial thing to look at. And so in that way, we can look at both kind of the early efforts of kind of gathering what today we would, is basically the kind of data that comes out of, social media, digital media, that kind of data that's collected about us and used to target, marketing or advertisements toward us. Um, Historically, right, they can't get that kind of granular information, but they're trying to gather as much of it as they can.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of kind of early geodemographics kind of measurement looking at different characteristics of neighborhoods, um, but also questions of aggregation, which are still kind of questions today. So how can we compare a lot of the early work of Tab is really how are we able to compare cities to gather like a kind of a national campaign? Because at that point, outdoor advertising and really, I'd say most advertising, other than some publications with a national audience, were focused on local areas, urban markets generally. So how do we measure one urban market in such a way that it can be compared to another urban market, and that those urban markets of similar size can then be aggregated up into kind of a national campaign? Um, and so there's this data element, but then also this visibility element. which is still very, very important today. There's in digital advertising, there's something called a viewable impression, which is a standard that's been set up in the digital advertising industry to measure basically whether or not an advertisement has been seen. Because you can imagine that there's some cases where an advertisement might pop up for a millisecond in the corner of your browser window, and they could count that as a view, or an impression is what they would call it. And so these various industry actors came together and said, we want to make sure that one impression for one website is the same as for another website, or for one provider is the same for another provider, right? So this standard measurement, which is basically so much of this ad has to be viewable on the screen for a certain period of time. I think that has a really kind of clear connection to the visibility of billboards, right? Which again are measuring how long does the viewer have to view it, if they're going, which is both a measure of speed and also like the how straight of a view do they have, how long are they in this, is dwell time is what it's called today. They didn't use that phrase back then though. And then also, yeah, comparative visibility. So yeah, really it's these two elements of visibility and kind of market information and how those two are fitting together that are most of interest to me with the billboards.
Hmm. That's great. What material did you explore in the Hagley archives to help you do this research?
Yeah, so the Hagley materials are actually kind of a follow-up, or a little bit further in time past the billboards. So I was looking at the archives of Batten, Barton, Durstine, and Osborn, the BBD&O archives there. BBD&O is still a very important agency. And so they worked with a number of really kind of big clients, had a lot of really big accounts, and were known in particular for their broadcast advertisements. So earlier on in radio, and then later in television. And so what I was looking at for them is in this kind of a similar sense to how I was talking about billboards having a particular spatiality. I'm curious also how television, radio is a really interesting one that I'm not kind of focusing on, but it's if I'm thinking about visibility, especially as we're getting into kind of digital media, which does rely a lot on viewability, focusing more on television. But BBD&O has a lot of really good materials about kind of their work thinking about the effectiveness of television advertising, and how they were planning these kind of advertising campaigns using various data research, and so on. And so they have the Hagley archives have a ton of material. I was only able to look at kind of key elements of it, but I'd say there may be three kind of main things that I was looking at. The first is kind of in-house research. So things that BBD&O was doing to try and understand the effectiveness of advertisements better. They have, there was a big study they did on repetition and the impacts of repetition, which is a really important kind of element for billboards as well. And still today, it's a question of how many times do you need to see an advertisement to remember it, which is of course tied into all these other elements of like what makes a good advertisement. They also have a number of like a ton of commercial testing, which is taking a television commercial, either a plan for it or a fully made commercial, and then running it through these different testing services. They had an in-house one, but they also contracted with a bunch of other vendors to basically run it in a certain market, right? Which again means a certain city, and then say how effective was this? So they would do a variety of different things to figure out how it was effective, which is calling people who viewed it, and asking them various questions to kind of tease out to what degree and what kind of attention they kind of paid to the commercial in a lot of ways. And then also they developed various what we'd call go-to-market models, which is fun names. The first one, or maybe not the first, but one of the first ones they came up with was called Demon, which is, I mean, not a very like auspicious name, I would say. But it's basically a measure of given a new product that we want to launch, and kind of the anticipated audience for it and where we would be able to do media placements or buy advertisements essentially. Like, is the investment going to pay out a profit, right? So basically determining it's a go, no go decision. Are we ready to launch it now, or do we need to do some more planning, or even maybe cancel the launch, I guess. So there's kind of those three elements, which all treat attention in different ways. And typically, like the Demon model, for example, and another one, later one called linear programming, really are quite mathematical, right? So they have all of these different variables that fit in, that about kind of the different audiences and the different media and the different expectations about what's going to happen to come up with a comparative measure. And so attention in a lot of these is not explicit. In some cases it is, where the discourses of attention often are in the framing or the introduction, where they're like, oh, well, we know that we need to break through the attention, the boredom barrier, or something like that is something that they say. And then in other cases, it's very much kind of buried in the modeling, right? Where it's like there's an assumption about how attention works, and so they're going to apply a certain kind of transformation to it in order to kind of understand it. And so I'm trying to tease out different kind of ways in which attention is emerging through the testing, through the modeling, through the in-house research, to see what kind of assumptions or knowledge about attention they're drawing on, and reproducing. Yeah.
Well, Jacob, it seems like a really fantastic project. Thank you for taking the time to share it with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Happy to.
And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and our funding opportunities of different kinds here at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.